As Nicole said, I'm Mike Isensee. I work for the State Department of Agriculture, as does Sherry, in the Dairy Nutrient Management Program. I've been up here just shy of 4 years working for the program. So for those of you associated with the dairy, I think I've met most all of you and been to your facilities, some more than you would like and some only twice so far. And as Nicole said, I'm going to speak about two different issues. One is record keeping, the second is water quality. And I want to say that I think that they're related. They're not directly connected, but related, as Sherry said. And I think with both, they're about storytelling. Talking about record keeping ultimately in my mind is how a dairy is telling its story and recording that story over time. Similarly with water quality sampling, it's telling the story about how bacteria is moving from the land into our waterways and ultimately downstream. And I'll get to that here in the second part of the talk. So first the legalese. Should talk a little bit about that. We have the revised code, and below that the WAC. There's some important language here in terms of the revised code with record keeping. There's two things that are a violation here other than not having a plan and getting it certified. One is having a discharge, but for record keeping, it's about maintaining records. So a violation is maintaining, failure to maintain your records for 5 years. And the second piece of that is that your records show that you're within acceptable agronomic rates. Now, late 2012, just about 3 years ago, this WAC at the bottom was passed, and it specified what those records are supposed to be. Dairies already should have known because in people's nutrient management plans it identifies the records that you're supposed to be keeping. In terms of records, I think the story starts with what it is you're applying. So under the rule, you're required to have an analysis of all the nutrients that you're applying to your fields. That's commercial product as well as organic product. So all sources, liquid and solid manure. A common shortcoming is the lack of solid testing that I see. And that for dairies that they're required to analyze annually all their organic sources for at least organic nitrogen, ammonia, nitrogen, and phosphorus. The question about what all sources mean is an interesting one because what's in your storage facilities changes throughout the year. And for a lot of the facilities here, you have multiple storage facilities. Different dairies use them in different ways and manage them differently. I have dairies that have flush systems. So here's a couple of different manure analyses. The first one there in the upper right is flush water from a dairy. It has very low nutrient values, less than 2 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 gallons, versus down on the bottom, this lagoon slurry that's 22 pounds per 1,000 gallons, more than 10 times more, speaking to the kind of variation you might see depending on the system you're using. And similarly, on this bottom one, they tested 2 different sources, the lagoon water and lagoon slurry, substantially different, 100% difference between those 2 sources. So depending on what source is going where, knowing what you're putting out there is vital to telling the story on your agronomy. If you think you're putting out 10 pounds and you're putting out 22, you're going to end up with a problem. Similarly, your story is incomplete. There's things missing if you don't have enough tests to show what you're putting on because it's changing throughout the year. Here's Here's testing from a dairy showing testing from 3 different ponds on the same day, 9th of March, and some of the variation. The numbers of total nitrogen there range from 6.4 to 14. So more than 100% difference depending on what storage structure they might have been pulling out of. Jump into the tail end of the story. So what you're putting on your ground, the nutrient value is the beginning. At the end is looking at the end of harvest, what's left. So a requirement of dairies is to do annual post-harvest soil test for nitrate, nitrogen. It's a backwards look. It's a report card as to what happened during the year. It's done in late summer after harvest, so after corn harvest. It's a challenge here because sometimes corn harvest is happening really late. Or in that September time period on grass. The method is doing composites in every field, doing multiple soil probe samples, compositing those and taking a sub-sample of those to the lab for analysis, so you're getting an accurate reflection across the fields. And the goal is to get 30 parts per million on corn fields or less, and 20 parts per million on grass fields. That equates to between 70 and 100 pounds of leftover nitrate in your fields. In Whatcom County, you can assume that that value is what's going to be lost out of the system through the year. That's what's going to be leaving the system during our winter rainfall and moving off-site. So it's a loss to the system, and we know that agriculture is a leaky system. So the idea is to try and minimize those leaks. They're not just environmental losses, they're an economic loss. Here's one set of soil tests. You can see that there's more fields than not were above those target range. One of those fields was at 45 parts per million. That 45 number is sort of a magic number for us, because if we see that number and we see it repeating in a field, it's speaking to some problem. Assuming that we're talking about a field that's not peat, it's not a really high organic matter field, that's a more complicated story. But with that number, and I'll go back to it in a minute and talk about it more. Every third year, dairies are required to do a complete soil test for their fields. That's looking at, it can include a post-harvest soil nitrate, if they're doing it at the right time. But it's also looking at organic matter, pH, the ammonium N level, phosphorus, and in Whatcom County we use a braid test that's supposed to be for our more acidic soils, potassium, and electrical conductivity. The third part is, what's the middle of the story? You know what the nutrient load is of your materials. At the end of the season, you're looking at what's left, but there's a whole middle of the story that you're writing during the season while your crops are growing. And that's about application records, recording what nutrients you're putting on. And like any good story or a new story, it's getting into those who, why, what, when, where, how pieces of the story. So where's it going, what the field is, when you're putting it on, each application, what method is being used. 3 different methods here in the pictures, and how you're putting it on matters in terms of what's happening on the field. What is it that you're putting on? What source is it coming from? What is it in terms of the nutrient load based on the testing you've done? And then why? And that was a new thing in our records in 2012, is documenting one of the whys. There's multiple whys that get to why this field at this time. Weather is one of the important things, especially in Whatcom County, and especially in that late summer through early spring, or even late spring in some years. Is this the appropriate time based on what the weather forecast is? But equally, and it's not required under rule, but equally in your story is that the right field to be going on? And are you doing it in the right way? Do you have adequate setbacks to surface water? Is there adequate depth of groundwater? Do you have good forage coverage? Is it the right place to be putting it? Further, in application records, under the rule, you're supposed to be looking at each field, what the crop was grown, or crops. We have many fields that are double cropped, either with cover crops or relay crops. What's the nutrient need of that crop based on a reasonable estimate of what you're going to grow? If you have a non-irrigated field and you're only getting on average 3 cuttings a year, that field shouldn't be getting the same level of nutrients as another grass field that's getting 6 cuttings a year and you're irrigating. And your records need to reflect that in terms of your applications. And then what's the total amount of nutrients applied during the season? And accounting for what other sources of nutrients are there. And we have a lot of soils that the inherent organic matter in that soil is providing a substantial amount of nutrients through the year. So accounting for that. And then back into the weather conditions, there's multiple ways of looking at the weather and recording that. And I have dairies now starting to record it in different ways. Some are writing down what the actual rainfall was, because that's the requirement, is to record the weather the day before and the day you're applying. I actually think you're better off if you're recording a better, broader context, such as what I'm showing here. What's the forecast looking forward over these next 5 days? We have I've unfortunately dealt with many conditions where people apply 3, 4, a week later, heavy enough rains fall on a field where the field conditions were not right for that application. That application didn't get into the ground where it's going to feed the crop, and instead some portion of it moved off-site, and then it becomes a water quality issue. And it becomes a loss to the dairy. There's other ways. Nicole's going to talk about it later. Her ARM worksheet works as a way to record weather. You can record it on a calendar where you're writing down some temperature and rainfall. And if you're doing it on a calendar, you can be writing your applications there too. And then it becomes a more complete picture of how you're mirroring your applications to what the weather is. So, manure transfers. For dairies, they're required to be both under their nutrient management plan and under this rule, accounting for the transfer of nutrients away from the dairy or the import of nutrients into the dairy. That includes the dates that those transfers are occurring, how much material, and the nutrient load. So again, back to the testing of nutrients. Who is receiving or supplying that nutrients and their contact information. Transfer agreements, and we have copies, I'll put them back on the registration table at lunchtime here. Transfer agreements are under dairy's plans an obligation for accounting for the waste that is moving or the nutrients that are moving. But they're, more importantly, they're really a way to make sure that whoever is sending and receiving these nutrients is communicating in a formal way some obligations that go with the nutrients and protecting both parties in terms of liability. Without an agreement, potentially the supplier, if it's a dairy, and the recipient could both be liable if there's an issue, either a non-agronomic application or a water quality violation associated with moving manure off-site and applying it to a field. If it's unclear who is responsible, everyone might be responsible. An agreement gives you the written record that, no, we agree, you're taking this much, and it's your responsibility to apply that agronomically. Under the proviso that Sherry talked about, we're going to be working this coming year recognizing that we have quite a lot of nutrients, especially in solid form, moving to berry producers in this county. And that there's been a shortcoming in the system, I would say, because berry producers aren't necessarily used to working with manure. Dairies are well aware that manure has both huge benefits agronomically out on their field, but it also has the potential to create water quality issues. That it has, that can harbor bacteria, and berries, they're aware that through their Food Safety Modernization Act about that they need to be managing manure appropriately, but not necessarily about water quality. So we're going to be doing some outreach about that. We're going to be doing some more testing to see what kinds of problems exist out there for berries. There's maybe a misconception that dairy solids don't harbor bacteria loads, that if it's gone through a certain amount of composting that it's going to be clean, and we're not sure that that's necessarily the case. And in many cases, the kind of composting that's happening on farm, unless there's some testing to show that it's clean, it may well be harboring some substantial bacterial loads still. So with exports, you have your date, contact information, and the amount that's moved. Dairies often have records that look more like this, where they're identifying who's receiving it, when, where, how much nutrients, and the total amount of nutrients. For many dairies, they are in nutrient balance by sharing their nutrients with neighboring growers. And so they're under an obligation to be tracking that and that it matches up with their plan. Finally, there's a requirement to have irrigation records. And if you have a water right in your dairy, you should be recording your, the amount of irrigation you're using. On each field, a total per year in inches. It becomes a way that you're showing the beneficial use of that water right. And it meets the letter of the law. If you don't have the water right, I'm not going to be the one that hang you out to dry by saying, where's your records for irrigation? Because the purpose of the irrigation records is the fact that our rule was written as a statewide rule. Irrigation and irrigation water management is, in my mind, nutrient management when you're east of the Cascades. Because they don't get the rainfall we do. The way they're moving nutrients in their system is through irrigation. And so irrigation practices define whether or not they're keeping their nutrients where they need to. We have a more challenging job here because Mother Nature moves our nutrients for us each winter. So ultimately, all your records get to what's an acceptable agronomic rate. When we go out on inspection, we're looking just at 1 year. We're looking through those 5 years. We're looking for trends. We're looking for, in particular, when we get to a compliance, we're looking at, is there multiple years where we have that elevated 45 parts per million or greater level of fall soil nitrates? And if we do, it's speaking to a problem on that field or in that system. In many cases. In some cases, it's not. I have a lot of fields here in Whatcom County that are peat soils, and it's very challenging because of how those soils function to be below that level because of how they test with the tests. Then I'm looking at what your application records show for what you're putting on, if it's matching up with what your crop should be using. But for compliance, we look at a trend. I have a box here around a set of values per field that 3 out of 5 years were above that 45 part per million. It's speaking to a problem. It's speaking to a problem even in the low years it was above the target. This isn't a peat field. And looking at the application records, it looked like they're applying more than they needed for their crop. And in this individual's case, it was potentially something that could be solved by they needed to be using a different source that they had on site and looking at changing their timing of when they were applying, and that it could be resolved. We'll be out there soon to see if they're doing that. With your records, and this is something that very few of my producers do, but I think it would behoove you in the climate we're in to be doing, is to physically be telling more of your story. Don't just let numbers tell your story, but record some words on your records annually. I know when I'm sitting with a producer and I'm going, 2011, why did you get this kind of fall test? I don't see anything in your application records that speak to it. And the producer will be like, I don't know, that's a long time ago. I'm like, yeah. With that in mind, put something in your records about why you did that. When you get your fall test back, and you're like, I got a high value, and you're working either with your consultant or you're sitting there with your family, talk about it. Did you have lower yields? Are you seeing a lot more weed pressure in that field and your grass isn't producing? Did you plant corn and it flooded out and you had to replant and you didn't get the time, growth days, and so you actually took off less corn, or it wasn't completely mature? I mean, oftentimes there's a reason. If you're capturing that in your record, you're telling your story. If you're not, then it's going to be lost. Similarly, if you have peat field conditions, if you have back in applications, if you're doing application or an application under arm and you're using 100-foot setbacks, write it in your records. So acceptable agronomic rate. This is that field that had most recently that 45 part per million, 33 out of the last 5 years. And it is this question of why is it elevated? Is it because down here they're underestimating mineralization from the soil? Was it an over-application for the crop? It was grass, this isn't corn. So it could be an appropriate amount of nutrients going on for grass, but if their yields are down, maybe not. And the last question I was left with there is, why did they have another application to this field when an October 1 soil test already showed that they already had an elevated value of nitrates? They've had this repeatedly on this field. By this time, there should be a response by the grower to go, I need to be managing this field differently. And if you think back to looking at their overall records, they had fields where they had much lower values. They have other fields that might be more appropriate to be going on. But the records don't have that full story. There could be good reasons why this is the field, that this is the last application, or they were doing applications on all their fields. The records can tell that story, but if it's not written down, the story is not being told. So there's a lot of ways that people are keeping records, from writing it on their calendar, notebook, working with consultants such as N3, the co-op here. I know that we have producers using Google Doc, Excel, documents that Nicole, I believe, is either going to talk about. I know she's working on a new Excel document. There's 2 online versions of record keeping I know of. One is free. It's called ODARC. It's from Oregon Department of Agriculture Record Keeping. The website link is there, odarc.org. And the best part about it is it's free. It's quite complete, but, well, also talk CaFoWeb. CaFoWeb is a for-profit based out of New Mexico. It is also doing an online version of record keeping. It has a lot of focus on irrigation as well as nutrient applications. Both of those online versions, one of the things that I think is a major roadblock for producers is there's a lot of time involved in tracking and data entry. But I would say that that's true whether you're using a notebook or calendar, whatever method you're using, there's a lot of time involved in tracking this down. But if you're not doing it, you're not telling your story. So it really is important to be keeping your records and keeping them up to date. I think a major shortcoming I see is people that this time of year are working on their records for last year, and it's really too late. The time to be doing your records is during the year, during the season, setting aside some time, making it as important as other pieces of running a successful dairy. So ongoing data entry is vital. Now jumping into water quality and why it matters and how it's measured is what I'm going to talk about. Why it matters. For those of you, and I think probably all of us in here that are farmers, you're upstream from downstream users. The major downstream user for folks that farm in the Nooksack River Basin is the shellfish producers down in Portage Bay that happen to be the Lummi tribal members. So there's additional issues because of the tribal member and treaty obligations that the federal government has with them that make it a little bit different than if it's a commercial operator, but ultimately it's the same system and it's the same regulations. So whether you're down in Samish Bay, where shellfish beds are closed occasionally and as a commercial producer, or here in Portage Bay, the issues are the same, the sampling regime is the same, and the goal is the same, is to allow those downstream users the same opportunity to have a successful business that you have. So for the last 7 years now, we've had an upward trend down in the water quality samples in Portage Bay. This graph shows 3 different sample sites in Portage Bay that are sampled monthly, and this shows a long-term trend. So these aren't individual sample results, but a combination of multiple sample results over a 2.5-year time frame. So as we're seeing a trend, it's reflecting of multiple months of data where it's going up on average over time. And that trend is continuing into the current. This just goes through last April, I believe. So because of that, a year ago, the State Department of Health that oversees shellfish production closed approximately 500 beds of shellfish producing area to harvesting, which is a substantial impact to downstream producers and harvesters of shellfish. And this year, based on this most recent year's data, we can expect several hundred more acres to close because there's additional sample sites in Portage Bay where the water quality is worsened to a level that it doesn't meet the federal and international standard for water over shellfish beds. So through 2007 to 2013, you can see this trend increasing but still meeting the standard, and then in the more recent time, it's been above the standard. It largely mirrors what's happening in our freshwater streams in terms of the trend. This is Fish Trap Creek and the average of samples that are being pulled in Fish Trap Creek over time, and then also Scott Ditch. And our other lowland tributaries are essentially the same. They bottomed out in the mid-2000s, and they've been trending upward in general ever since. So we know that the practices upstream affect what's happening downstream. We know that those practices don't just involve farms, and they don't just involve dairies. They involve everyone who's upstream. They involve folks that are living in Linden, and the city of Linden is much more on board today than they were a year ago because of water sampling, identifying that there's problems here in Linden with what kind of bacteria are leaving through storm drains and entering Fish Trap Creek. They involve our neighbors to the north, so it's an international problem that involves Canada, since both Fish Trap and Bertrand Creek, half of each of those watersheds are in Canada, and water quality testing at the border is showing that there's a substantial issue from our neighbors to the north. And to the north, the issues are the same as here. It's not just farms, and it's not just some other source. It's all kinds of different sources happening. It's interesting, at least in Bertrand Creek, while in Fish Trap Creek, I don't think there's any dairies. And specifically in Double Ditch, part of Fish Trap Creek, there's no dairies. There's very little intensive land uses, but we have the same kind of trend. There are some facilities up there that are not agricultural that we think are the likely source. At least I think they're the likely source. They're compost operations. So we know that there's lots of different potential sources. The focus and why it matters is that a lot of them are preventable. By a change in practices, we can reduce the standard, reduce the water quality issues and the bacteria loading going into the water. We did it before, a decade ago. We could see that the standards were being met. So how's it measured? This could be a whole talk in and of itself, but briefly, there's two things that are happening out there on the landscape, two kinds of sampling. One is an ambient sampling, so pre-established stations across the landscape where the sample is pulled on a pre-established basis, regardless of the weather. It's pulled in the summer and the winter whenever water is flowing, usually monthly, and so the date is preset, usually week or month in advance, and that gives you a sense of what the ambient conditions are over time, because you can look at that over time. You can do an average, a geo-mean, So that's what those trend maps are based on. We have 20-some odd stations throughout Portage Bay and Sac River drainage that are ambient stations. The county is monitoring those. Then there's ambient stations that are more focused, where there has been high counts. Fish Trap Creek is one of those where the county is now sampling an additional almost 30 stations weekly. They're doing that on a preset day, regardless of conditions, to see if they can find trends in the different sub-watersheds within Fish Trap Creek. Now, the other kind of sampling is what we as an agency and what the Department of Ecology is doing out on the landscape, and that's what source identification sampling. We're out and we're looking for what are the sources that we can find. We're going out when we think the conditions are more likely to show a problem. So wet conditions, we don't do a lot of sampling in the summertime. We do it mostly through the fall, winter, and spring, because that's when we typically are seeing the higher counts. And so we're looking for sources. We're trying to identify by bracketing upstream and downstream, see where numbers are going up and going, okay, here's an area where numbers are going up. We're using the other data, the ambient data, to help direct us to where should we focus our time and energy. But we're doing that throughout the county. Samples are collected. We use sampling pools. There's set bottles that we collect out of. There's a standard operating procedure about trying to keep your bottles from getting contaminated. They go on ice. They get delivered to the lab within 6 hours. And the lab, there's 3 different labs in the county that can analyze these samples, but they use a standard method to look at the sample. The picture on the right shows what one of those samples looks like in the lab. They report back what the numbers are. In the upper right, you see the standard method that's being used for these analyses, and then the other red box shows the results, all of which are, in this case, over the water quality standard. So that's the brief of how it's measured. I want to talk then also briefly about some new technology that we have started using just this fall, and that's to be using iPads out in the field that enable us to, when we see something like this or when we're out sampling, we can take a picture. We can identify on a map where that picture is taken, and we can collect a sample there. And then that sample will be hosted on an online map that is available to anyone. In this case, the sample collected was 3,200 fecal coliforms. The legal limit under the state standard would be 200 fecal coliforms for a single sample. And in this case, this isn't at a dairy facility, so it was sent over to the Department of Ecology to contact these property owners and start the regulatory technical assistance process of working with them to identify changes in practices so that there isn't an ongoing issue of bacteria leaving and getting into the water. So for us this fall, we've created this online map where our sample results are posted, and 3 to 7 days after we're out sampling, we're posting on the map. Here before winter is over at least, we hope that this map will also include the sampling that Department of Ecology is doing locally, so that all of what we're calling source identification sampling in Whatcom County is on one map that anyone can go to. The easiest way, there's a link at the bottom that's maybe a little hard to read, but the easiest way to get to this site is to do a search for Whatcom County water quality. You can go to the county's water quality website and then to their results page. They links not only to our results, but they have maps that also are showing the ambient sampling that's going on and the data behind that sampling. So you can go and look at different maps. The Lummi Tribe now is posting, and their results down at the bottom of the watershed are on that site. the State Department of Health in the marine waters. Their results are on that site. So we're working to try and get these results out so that you, the people on the land, the people that are going to be able to make changes to affect this water quality for better or worse can see what's going on. Because I think it's become fairly apparent to me that if the people that can make decisions that affect water quality don't know what's going on, then why would they make different decisions? You don't know that there's a problem in your area, in your stream stretch, then you figure, well, what I'm doing is fine. But if you get water results and go and you can look at the result from last week, you know, well, what was I doing or not doing that could be affecting this? That gives you information to decide, is there something I can do differently? Do I need to be looking at cleaning something up? Do I need to be looking at my applications if I apply and then there's a high count? I, as a regulator here, am not going to make the water quality improve. It's going to be the folks in this room that do that, not me. And that's it.